That'd be great. Oh,
Whenever
excuse me.
y'all give us like a nod and
I'll let you know.
thank you.
Story of my life.
You want, I can write and print them out. There's a printer back there.
I do it all the time.
It'll be fine. I don't print that. If you want to use that,
It's up to you.
Okay.
Maybe just make a flat copy.
Okay. Let's make it start.
She wants us to be here. Story of my life. If I hadn't gotten married, I always did, so I got here a little bit. Yes.
You will not.
Yeah, exactly.
You can start whenever you'd like.
Okay. Well, hello and welcome everyone to Bell Chapel. We are so glad that you've joined us tonight for some very important conversation. My name is Allison, and this is Rose. We are the co-presidents of the Interfaith Leadership Council. We are excited to put on this event with the help of our club partners, UNICEF and Call to Action. So thank y'all so much for coming out. Thank you everyone who had a hand in planning, organizing, and setting up this program and the space we share tonight.
So for tonight's structure, we're going to start with a discussion that's led by our moderators, Dante and Callie, and that'll be for about 45 minutes, and then we will switch into a general Q&A session, and by 7 o'clock, we will transition to the rotunda where there's food, and you can put any donations that you have, as well as write cards for some of the Afghan refugees currently arriving in the country.
We would also like to share with you all an invitation to Brave Space. So this is a poem that was written by Mickey Scott B. Jones, and it kind of talks about orienting ourselves towards difficult conversations. So, an invitation to a brave space. Together we will create a brave space because there's no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So kind of keeping that in mind, we wanted to just reiterate that this is kind of an educational discussion to learn more about a topic that you may or may not know much about. And also, so in that mind, we want to be respectful and make sure we are approaching things from an attitude of learning and growing rather than argumentation.
So before we start, we want to take a moment of silence to acknowledge those who have lost their lives or been harmed due to this crisis, as well as the refugees who are now searching for new homes beyond the one they already knew, and for the men and women of our military who are serving us every day. All right, thank you. To kick us off, moderators and panelists, would you please introduce yourselves, including your name, faith, background, and why you are interested in this discussion?
My name is Dante Washington. I am the current president of Call to Action. I practice Wicca faithfully, and I am interested in this topic because I've always wanted to learn more. I've always wanted to do something. I always wanted to be an active member in my community. And if there's any chance that I'm able to be granted to be able to make a positive influence, I'll take that chance.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kalpika Pradeep. I am half Hindu, half Christian, and so I have a very diverse faith background. I also grew up in a Muslim country and went to a Catholic school, so I was exposed to as many religions as I could. I am the co-president of UNICEF, and the reason why I'm here today is because The way my parents brought me up was to always think if you have food on your plate and a roof on top of your head, you're much more blessed than a lot of people on earth, and you're always going to have to strive to help others in need and always bring others up with you.
Hi, I'm Alexa Royden. I'm a professor in political science, and I'm an atheist. I am the secular and humanist student or representative for students on campus. So I do a lot of work with the interfaith community. I study conflict and war. So that's why I'm here to chat tonight about specifically the war in Afghanistan.
Hi, I'm Hadia Mubarak. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And my faith, which is sort of visible, I'm Muslim. It's one of the religious traditions of the Abrahamic faiths. So, a lot of similarities between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I think every time I have students look at the scriptures side by side, they're always so surprised to see those similarities. My main interest in this topic is the focus on both women and gender in Islam, as well as sort of the Taliban and the rise of movements like the Taliban. How do we understand them? What's the best sort of framework or lens we can use to sort of understand the emergence of a group like the Taliban and its nature and origins, etc.
So our first question will be for Dr. Royden. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. And can you talk a little bit about the political context and history of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan?
Okay, so thankfully they sent me these questions in advance, because I will tell you, I saw that one and I was like, oh, how much time do we have? So
About 10 minutes.
Apologies, first of all, to my history colleagues. I am about to do some brutality to history. So in order to really understand the US involvement in Afghanistan, you have to recognize that Afghanistan has been subject to colonial interference for over 100 years. First with the British, and then the Russians, and then the United States. So there is a long and complex history there. I'm going to say complex a lot, just so you know. The other thing that I would want to note up front is that Afghanistan is very diverse. I actually have some handouts if anybody wants to share those. Sorry, they will get them to you in just a second. It's a weird amalgamation of like 3 little pieces, but one of the things at the top of the handout, do you guys have those? Yes, that'd be great. One of the things at the top of the handout is a map that shows you sort of the ethnic diversity within Afghanistan. Afghanistan has 9 different languages, okay? However, much of the civil conflict in Afghanistan comes from that diversity, and the diversity isn't around religion. 98% of Afghans are Muslim, the vast majority of them are Sunni, but it is worth noting that the Afghan demographic is deeply complex, okay? So to jump ahead a little bit, in the late 1970s, Afghanistan shifted towards a leftist regime. It was not a democratic transition, and it was supported by the Soviets. And the Soviets essentially occupied Afghanistan from 1979 until 1989. As a result of that, you saw the rise of a resistance, and that resistance is referred to as the Mujahideen, okay? But that implies there was unity, and there was not. The Mujahideen is made up of multiple groups in Afghanistan, okay? And so what happened when they eventually expelled the Soviets is that you had a very brief period of time where the Mujahideen held it together, and then it devolved into civil war. And during that period, there was an enormous amount of corruption, violence, instability, all right? And one thing that you can say the world over is that human beings don't care for those conditions. You saw the rise of a group in northern Pakistan along the border with Afghanistan called the Taliban, the leader of which had been associated with the Mujahideen but wasn't necessarily representative of the entire group, okay? So the Taliban offered stability and was initially welcomed because it was an alternative to the instability that Afghanistan had been experiencing for so long. Unsurprisingly, a counterforce rose to that in the north, all right, and that was the Northern Alliance. And again, that is a loose association of different groups. Afghanistan is sort of bisected by very large mountains, part of the Himalayas, so geography matters a lot. There is the southern sort of sweep of Afghanistan. You have a large Pashtun population that crosses over into Pakistan, and then you have all of these different ethnic groups nested throughout Afghanistan. So essentially that civil war went on until we invaded in 2001. Now you're probably wondering how Al-Qaeda fits into this. As the Mujahideen was fighting the Soviets, you had an influx of fighters from around the Islamic world to help support the freedom of Afghanistan. And they came from many countries, certainly Saudi. And you see the rise of Al-Qaeda in the region, you know, as a presence, but they are separate from the Taliban. Now, 20 plus years later, there's been an enormous amount of social mixing, intermarriage. I mean, is there really a realistic way to separate the two? I'm not entirely certain. Actually, I'd say no. But it is worth noting that they are a distinctly different, they come from a different place, okay? The Taliban rose after really predominantly the experience with Russia. So a lot of the young Taliban fighters didn't necessarily have that experience. So you have very different groups functioning in Afghanistan. And you're actually seeing that now. After the United States pulled out, you're seeing more schism, right? The Northern Alliance has largely, they maintain a presence, but they aren't really an operational presence at this point. You have ISIS, ISIS-K, which has moved into the region, and I'm happy to talk about that. And then, of course, you have the Taliban, which is the government of the country and has control of the country at the moment. So how does the United States factor into all of this? Well, as you're aware, although many of you don't remember, Al-Qaeda launched an attack against the United States, 9/11. It was a substantial and visible attack. The United States was going to respond. I'm happy to talk about the legality of that or any questions you have on that, but the United States did respond. Again, this gets complicated, but they wanted the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, depending on various reports, you know, certainly put that off and ultimately declined. There is some indication that they made some efforts to, you know, meet US demands, but that didn't happen. So the United States invaded. And the thing that's really interesting about this is that it is a classic case of possibly having a strategic focus in the beginning and that strategic focus losing any sort of direction over time. For good or ill, you know, we can certainly talk about it. The United States did a pretty handy job of dismantling Al-Qaeda and the Taliban at the time. I would personally argue that because we were not able to get Osama bin Laden, it felt unfinished, and that's part of what kept us there. And when we eventually did capture Osama bin Laden and execute him, you know, then what? I would argue that the US presence in Afghanistan for 20 years has had very little strategic direction. And I would also argue that most Americans didn't care, because for all intents and purposes, just having thrown the military at the problem, it made people feel safer. It is worth noting that there hasn't been another major terrorist attack on US soil from Al-Qaeda. That is arguably a success. But Al-Qaeda as a presence certainly adapted to the US invasion of Afghanistan. There are many related and semi-related terrorist organizations today around the world. Certainly our invasion did not dismantle that threat. Okay, and then of course, you know, if you want to talk about ISIS, that's a completely different topic. So I'll just move that to the side for the moment. What I would note, if you look at the handout that I gave you, is that the US presence in Afghanistan started fairly small and ramped up under Barack Obama. You might remember the idea of, having a push to somehow create stability. It was not successful. Under Barack Obama, we deployed up to 100,000 troops to Afghanistan, which is a massive number, okay? And in the last few years, that troop level was drawn down to, a couple thousand. And in 2020, February 2020, essentially the Trump administration negotiated a proposed peace that would, 14 months later, result in the withdrawal of US troops. This creates a really, really complicated picture, okay? And I'm happy to talk about that as well. Whatever you guys' interests happen to be, I'm happy to go there. But it is worth noting, and the last little piece of that handout is the refugee status. Afghanistan has, for the last 4 decades, almost 5 decades, experienced significant instability, and this is not a new crisis, okay? There are over 1 million refugees in Iran. There are over 1 million refugees in Pakistan. They have that as a slightly lower amount on the graph that I showed you, but most reports indicate there are close to 1 million refugees in Afghanistan. There have been waves of Afghan refugees going to different countries depending on push factors within the country. There are over 2 million internally displaced people in Afghanistan, okay? So the difference between refugees, asylees, internally displaced people, happy to talk about that. But the point is this instability has led to mass people movement. And today there aren't a lot of places for Afghans to go. Okay, so I'm happy to talk about, our system for special visas versus going through the refugee process at the United Nations, et cetera. But right now you have a fair number of Afghans who want out but have nowhere to go. So I will stop there because I could spend the whole time talking about the political situation in Afghanistan. I will close though with saying that the United States, it is fairly clear, whatever goals we had, we failed. And we left a pretty catastrophic humanitarian situation in our wake. And that begs the question of what moral responsibility we have as Afghanistan and the Afghan people try to, clean up the mess. So again, happy to talk about any of that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Royden. We truly didn't need a lot of our background check just because I feel like these days a lot of people don't really know what exactly happened in the past, and right now it's just a lot of opinions being flooded. But having to know what exactly happened, how the timeline went through, and what the current situation is really helps people to get a better view. But we'll move on to Dr. Mubarak. Can you talk a bit about the complexities related to the Taliban within the religious and cultural context of Afghanistan?
First of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Royden. I feel like I could keep listening to you throughout this. Very fascinating. So I just want to kind of also follow up on this catastrophe, right? To kind of put things in perspective. We've led a war for 20 years to dismantle the Taliban. Something like $14 trillion was spent on this war. We have over 7,000 servicemen that have died after post 9/11 war operations. And then in Afghanistan, Pakistan, about 71,000 civilians have died directly as a result of this war. And now we are back. The end result is the Taliban is back in power, right? So we've circled to the very end, and to really put things in perspective. But I want to address 2 questions, which is first, is the Taliban primarily a political or religious organization or movement? And second, is the Taliban a terrorist organization? And I think to first answer the first question, I'm going to sort of remind us of some of the points that Dr. Royden just mentioned, that we have to also understand the context in which the Taliban emerged to understand the nature of the Taliban. And that context is specifically it emerges as an anti-imperialist tribal movement that wants to protect the autonomy of the country, right? So we think of the Soviet occupation, which another really important point I want to stress is that as citizens and residents of the United States, we cannot allow ourselves to have temporary amnesia, and we need to take ownership of the role that we had in directly supporting and training and providing aid to the mujahideen that led to the rise of the Taliban, right? So it's like we were directly complicit, and that is not something that we were really owning up to when 9/11 happened, right? Although the Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11, those are two separate things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, I don't want to get into 9/11. We can't get into 9/11. Point is, with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the point being was they had given shelter to bin Laden, who was the head of Al-Qaeda at the time. And also to add a point to what Dr. Royden mentioned, one narrative is that the Taliban had put a condition that if the United States was willing to provide evidence that bin Laden was responsible for the attacks, that they had been willing to hand him over. This is one of the narratives there. And since that, but to go back to the nature of the Taliban, how and why do they emerge? So they emerge in this context that Dr. Royden had described as really primarily an anti-imperialist, anti-occupation political movement that came in the midst also of after 1989, when the Soviets finally withdraw, and also with the help of the United States having supported the Mujahideen, supported the resistance, the Soviet resistance. At the time, President Jimmy Carter first, and then after him, President Ronald Reagan believed it was in the interest of the United States to basically fight this proxy war and help the Afghan resistance fight this war. And so one of the things that happened is aid was also given to Pakistan, which provided, and so this is where religion comes into the picture, right? So there were these madrasas that were funded. Now, Saudi Arabia also enters the picture, and this is where a Wahhabi religious ideology is inculcated in some of the people who later become leaders of the Taliban. What is Wahhabi ideology? It emerges in the 18th century, and honestly, the man who is considered the kind of forefather of this ideology, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, was considered a deviant and aberrant by his contemporaries, contemporaneous Sunni scholars, and even denounced by his own father and brother. And he had a very literalist, kind of extreme interpretation of Islam. He took certain theological concepts, like the concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God, which is an important theological premise in Islam, that God is one, took this to a extreme degree as to, well, what does that mean in practice? So he, for example, Sufism and the practice of mystical practice, spiritual practice, was always a very vibrant part of Islam. He denounced it as heretical. A lot of practices also, so had it not been for the alliance between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and the founder of the modern nation state of Saudi Arabia, had it not been for that political religious alliance, I honestly believe that we would never even be talking about Wahhabi ideology today. Because I will emphasize that Wahhabi ideology, which is very literalist, right? And I don't want to get too complicated in terms of explaining how it's literalist, but throughout Muslim history, scholars have had methodologies of deriving law, deriving interpretation, and it was a very complex legal system that wasn't like, oh, we're going to take this passage from the Quran, like the infamous sword verse, for example, right, which we call the sword verse today, and just like, literally interpret this, or we're not, taking a passage. And so a passage from the hadith. So he advocated what some people call the Salafi approach. It was more than just a Salafi approach. It was really extreme, because Salafism, the idea of Salafism is just going back to the sources directly and bypassing this medieval tradition through which Islam has been mediated. Point being, this is where religion sort of fits in, and by the time that the Taliban emerges and kind of is influenced by the Wahhabi ideology, it really transplants into Afghanistan a ideology that is not familiar at all, that had not existed previously in Afghanistan. And So this is where religion fits in. However, I would argue that it would be incorrect for us to primarily identify the Taliban as a religious organization because their primary motive is political governance, anti-occupation, and consolidation of power. The second question I mentioned is in regards to, is the Taliban a terrorist organization? And one of the, I don't know if you remember back in 2009, there was a foreign service officer who resigned and made his resignation very public and had sent a letter to the Department of State. His name was Matthew Ho, H-O-H. And you can find a lot of it. You can actually find his letter. He made his resignation as a foreign service officer very public when he left Afghanistan. What was really interesting about his argument is that the very military presence of the United States basically enabled the justification of the Taliban's existence. If the Taliban was formed as an anti-imperialist force to get the Soviets the hell out of their country, right? That was a very basically objective of what they were trying to do and consolidate power. And obviously there's a little bit more complexity to that, which Dr. Royden alluded to with the kind of civil war going on in Afghanistan. And they had this sort of pan-Pashtun movement that helped eliminate some of that rivalry. So if that's the very premise, then when the United States, invaded and then occupied and continued and, kind of dragged out that occupation to the extent that it did, it almost gave fuel to the very reason that the Taliban had initially emerged, right? And this is exactly what we saw. They came back. So I think it's worth looking at Matthew Ho's letter from 2009 where he predicted this. And he had said something, I remember actually listening to him on NPR many years ago. And he said he came to the realization that this was not a group that would ever fly planes into the Twin Towers, that this was not Al-Qaeda, and that the only reason they were fighting the United States, he said, is because we were on their soil. We were in their country. And as long as we were there, as long as we were occupying Afghanistan, they were going to continue to fight. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but.
No. Thank you so much. I think it's important to distinguish some of the philosophies and theologies of those that are actually within these major groups because, normally the United States has this fantasy of putting ourselves on a pedestal, but once you start to get all of the different reasons why these people do the things that they do and all of the things that they have to deal with, it just seems like their actions kind of are justified in a sense. But we will go to our next question. This one is kind of just open-ended to whoever would like to answer. So how are the Taliban's actions or beliefs affected by politics and or religion? Also, how does their actions affect the civilians? And how does the United States involvement also affect the civilians?
Okay, so I actually want to add something. Hadia asked, her second question is the Taliban a terrorist organization? And my students hear this all the time from me. Terrorism is a tactic, okay? It's a tactic. It's a type of political violence. There are different types of political violence: assassination, guerrilla warfare, terrorism. I think what happens is that we conflate organizations that to our convenience, our political convenience. Certain organizations that use terrorist tactics, and we call them terrorist organizations, not recognizing that pretty much any political actor can use terrorism. States can use terrorism. The United States, any number of states can use terrorism, right? It isn't just confined to that. And that political, that type of violence is using violence against civilians in order to achieve a political outcome. It doesn't matter who does it. That's what terrorism is, okay? So I think that we can focus on specific organizations, not recognizing that terrorism can happen anywhere and from any actor. I would also say that it doesn't matter how legitimate your cause, terrorism is still ethically wrong. You are targeting civilians, okay? And under international law and under pretty much any ethics of war tradition, targeting civilians is considered to be a no-go. Now, a lot of states try to finesse that, but it is pretty clear. right? So I think we can get confused with what is, I would actually argue, a fairly common phenomenon, which is trying to fight an imperial power, and is arguably a perfectly legitimate thing to do, with the tactics utilized by either the Taliban or, in the case of the United States. You could certainly argue that some of the tactics we used were deliberately designed to create fear within the population in order to achieve a political outcome. The usage of drones extensively is a really good example. So it's always more complicated than we want it to be, and I would simply caution that there is a human sort of natural response to categorize the world into us and them, and not take a really good hard look at how the various parties are operating. As somebody who spent my lifetime studying war, nobody comes out of a war with their hands clean, okay? So when we talk about the Taliban, I agree 100% with Hadia that this is fundamentally a political contest, okay? And, you know, the Taliban and other groups within Afghanistan who are now differentiating themselves from the Taliban are fighting for, you know, political control. Politics in its very simplest sense is how power is organized in a society, in its very simplest sense. And, you know, the United States was trying to reorganize power in Afghan society. The Afghans themselves had some thoughts about that, right? Even the Afghans who did not support the Taliban probably had some thoughts about the American occupation. So, you know, it's just important to note, and I would argue if you're looking at, you know, this ISIS activity within the state, the Northern Alliance potentially trying to reconstitute, you know, counter to the Taliban, this is a political fight. I don't happen to think it's a deeply religious fight. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, religion hasn't influenced the formation of these movements, which it has. And I actually, this is where I think that's a really interesting point that you made about the early, you know, support for the Wahhabist tradition. I will say that this type of radical reactionary movement is happening all over the world. This is not just happening in Afghanistan. It's not just happening in Syria. It's not just happening in Iraq. You know, you are seeing the articulation of some pretty radical versions of Christianity in this country. You are seeing radicalization of, certainly, look at what's happening with Buddhists in Sri Lanka. Look at what's happening, you know, the Buddhists attacking Muslims in Myanmar. You are seeing radicalization happen globally. And there's something there in response to the way in which the world is changing. So yes, it's not that the religious aspect doesn't matter, it does, but specifically in Afghanistan, it really is a political fight, I would argue, but.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to ask you if you could just repeat the first question of that, because I want to make sure I heard that.
How are the Taliban's actions or beliefs affected by politics and or religion?
Okay, Andrew. So I will talk a little bit now about the sort of draconian measures that we've seen the Taliban implement. And, you know, it would take, I can imagine like a semester for us to just go into identifying why their interpretation of Islam is incredibly problematic. And again, you know, one point I always point out is that when you look at traditional scholars who've been trained in religious seminaries, some of the oldest and most recognized religious seminaries in the Muslim world, like Al-Azhar or Zaytuna or the clerics from Qum, these are, believe it or not, oftentimes the most important counter to terrorism and to extremism. So for example, you know, we often, whenever a terrorist, especially if it happens to be someone of the Muslim faith, does something very violent, we hear about it, right? But when clerics from around the Muslim world sign a letter condemning these actions, I mean, that doesn't make it to the front page of the New York Times or doesn't get any time on Fox News or something like this. But for example, when ISIS was formed, I can't even tell you how many Muslim scholars, but they had almost the Grand Mufti of every Muslim majority state on this letter, and it was called Open Letter to Baghdadi. Baghdadi was the name of the so-called caliph of ISIS, the leader of ISIS, and well-known religious scholars, the highest religious authorities in Islam, wrote a letter, a very long letter, you can find it online, detailing how ISIS's practices were in direct violation of Islamic law, direct violation of the Quran and the prophetic teachings. The Taliban has some pretty draconian policies and interpretation of Islam as well. Obviously, some of the ones we've heard of most are in regards to women and gender. And where do they get these bizarre interpretations from? A lot of it you can kind of trace back to Salafism, literalist interpretation, or even sometimes there is no text to support the interpretation. It's a certain ideology, right? Like this notion that men and women should be completely segregated, right? Which I always say, when we think of the Muslim world, we often think of Saudi Arabia, and I can't tell you how much Saudi Arabia is an anomaly to the rest of the Muslim world. Like it is a complete anomaly. As someone who has traveled to so many Muslim majority countries, until now, being in Saudi, although I love going there only because of the sacred sites, but it's so unsettling to be there. It's so unsettling in so many ways. Just the hierarchy, the racism, the sexism, right? It's so blatant. It's so explicit. The hypocrisy, right? And I don't want this to turn into a talk on Saudi Arabia, but that ideology clearly impacted some of the leaders of the Taliban. And so, where do they get this interpretation of complete segregation of men and women so that women should not even go to school so that they're not taught by men and they're not seen by men? Like what textual support do they have? What religious text in Islam supports this? There really is no direct religious text. We have religious texts to the contrary. We have, for example, hadith traditions from the Prophet, which is a secondary source of Islamic law, saying that you should seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave, that you should seek knowledge even if you were to go to China. We have the Prophet's own precedent, right? There's this concept called sunnah meaning the example of the Prophet, that after the Quran, following the Quran, then the secondary source would be the Prophet's sunnah, his precedents, the way he lived Islam, right? I always think of, those bracelets sometimes when I was in high school and I grew up in the South, they would wear the what would Jesus do bracelets, right? And I always be like, that's what the sunnah is for Muslims, right? It's like, what would Muhammad do? It's like, what would Jesus? It's exactly what it is, right? And so you have the Prophet's own precedent where in his own mosque in Medina, the men and women were in one space, where he had designated special classes to teach women until the very end of his life, where he told his male companions, seek knowledge from, he referred to his wife, Al-Humayra, the one who's redheaded, right? His wife, Aisha. And she is the second most, she has transmitted in terms of these hadith, right? Which are an incredible body of religious texts. I mean, theology, law, so many disciplines are derived from these texts. And she has transmitted over 2,000 of these traditions from the Prophet. And they're all deemed, no female has transmitted a hadith, a prophetic tradition that was deemed to be inauthentic. That's a whole other thing, but there's a whole science of hadith that looks at the level of authenticity of these texts, right? And every text that was been transmitted by a woman was deemed as reliable. And so if women were not to be educated, why would the Prophet have requested from his own companions to go study from his wife? After his death, many of the caliphs would go consult her. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, the second caliph, they would go consult her. Even, after the rise of the Umayyad dynasty with Muawiyah, he would even go and consult Aisha. And we have records, we have historical records of this. So anyway, just in short, I mean, there is, in my opinion, and in opinion of people who've studied this and spent like a lifetime studying the Islamic tradition, absolutely no justification for their draconian and, extreme policies against women and civilians in general and people in general. And it is a point of concern. I mean, I am concerned. A lot of Afghans are concerned. Everyone's sort of holding their breath right now and waiting to see what's going to happen. At the same time, I think we need to be careful of this sort of dichotomous view we often see in the West, where we imagine ourselves as liberators. And we are the ones who, you know, when we went into Afghanistan, we symbolized hope for Afghan women. And, you know, and a lot of the, and whereas the East, or Islam in specific, is often conflated with the East, is the opposite, the mere opposite. And if you don't mind, Allison, if you do have any of those cartoons, I don't think we have, I printed out 25 copies and then left them at home, but you can kind of pass them on and share them. But this was a really, and after you take a look at them, you can maybe pass them on. But this was recently published in The Economist magazine, which is a reputable magazine, a magazine I respect very much. But you can clearly see in these images the way how we view ourselves as the US military and the role we played in quote unquote liberating women versus obviously quite clearly the Taliban. But what's problematic in that cartoon is the way the Taliban and Islam are sort of conflated, right, with Sharia. And in fact, the Gallup polling, one of the largest studies done on the Muslim world, shows that Muslims actually care for Sharia. They do not view Sharia as a draconian, ancient, anti-woman, misogynist, oppressive system that we view it, which is a dominant view we find in Western portrayals of Sharia. That in fact, the Gallup poll, Sharia, what is Sharia? I just want to say very, very briefly, Sharia is an abstract concept that means divine law, right? So the idea that I have to give charity to people in need is part and parcel of Sharia. The idea that I need to stop everything I'm doing and pray 5 times a day to remember God and connect with God, that is Sharia, right? And so Sharia is this abstract concept of divine law. So some of these images, very problematic. And this dichotomous view, I just want to say, is kind of embedded in Orientalism, this notion that Eastern civilization is the antithesis of Western civilization and incompatible with Western values. So if we're democratic, they're authoritarian. If we're peaceful, they're violent. And if we're egalitarian, they're misogynist. And you kind of see that playing out even in this cartoon in The Economist magazine. So sorry, that was really long-winded.
And I actually just sort of wanted to add to that something like a totally random detail. In terms of de-radicalization efforts for some of these extremist movements, the most successful interveners are Muslim clergy. If you want to de-radicalize, it's not us. We're not the ones who are doing that work successfully. It's Muslims who are doing that work successfully. So.
Well, thank you very much for that great insight, both of you. I think we're off to a great start over here. Right? Yeah. Okay, our next question is, what is something important for people who are not connected to the conflict to know about it? And what are some ways do you think people can get involved?
Okay, wow, this is a big one. I would say, and I'm just going to take the perspective of, from the vast majority of Americans have really not had to engage with this issue meaningfully ever, okay? Fewer than 1% of Americans serve in our military. The people who do serve in our military have been doing relentless deployments for the last 20 years. I would say that something Americans need to understand is that we have, in pursuit of some sort of ephemeral need for security, essentially put the burden of that on a tiny percentage of Americans. And we have asked them to go into a country and do things we don't want to talk about. And they've come home, and now it's over. And if you don't think the vet community is undergoing some pretty significant trauma right now, you are wrong. There are a lot of people who are questioning why they lost friends, why did they go there? Why did their marriage fall apart? Why were they away from their children for so long? What was the purpose of it all? And I think in this country, we have a habit of saying, oh, it was the politicians, and blaming everybody except the person staring back at you in the mirror. And the thing is, we're a democracy, and we decided we didn't care because it was comfortable and convenient. And I am not even beginning to address the fallout that's happening in Afghanistan right now, right? I have a very, very good Afghan friend. Who we worked on our PhDs together, who was on one of the last flights out of Kabul, worked for the government, and the devastation is significant. But what I can say that I think most Americans don't understand with our flag lapel pins and our, we are deeply committed to performative patriotism, but we are not particularly good at taking responsibility for decisions that are made in our name. You don't get to opt out. When I first came to Queens, which was 13 years ago, we were unsurprisingly talking about this because we've been at war for 20 years. And I had a student in the back raise his hand and say, I'm just sick of it and I've turned the war off. And all I could think was, how convenient for you that you have that privilege. So I suppose what I would say that I think people need to understand about this and any other conflict is that we are responsible. We may not be guilty, but we are responsible. And there's a distinction there, okay? So anyhow, as you can tell, I have feelings about this. I was in 9/11, I was in Washington, D.C. for 9/11. You don't want to know what I was thinking the day after because it wasn't nice. So I do understand the power of emotion here. But that being said, the United States needs to do some serious reflection, and I don't see us doing that yet.
Thank you so much. So I guess what do I want people to know about the war? First of all, I will say that as someone who has traveled to the Middle East and have family in the Middle East, is to recognize that there tends to be a pretty big gap between how we see ourselves as Americans and our role in many parts of the world, including the Middle East, and how they view us, right? There tends to be a huge misalignment or gap, and I think that's something we need to begin to address. We talk a lot about being a kind of a global community. I think we need to become more attuned to the sentiments of people in other parts of the world, especially people whose policies, who are directly impacted by our foreign policies. And in regards to women's rights, I do want to talk about this briefly. I have people come up to me a lot and talk to me like, oh my gosh, what about Afghan women? What's going to go on? And as someone who has studied colonial feminism and recognizing the way women's rights and the rhetoric of women's rights was used by colonialists, especially in North Africa and the Middle East, to morally legitimate the project of colonialism. And knowing that history makes me very uncomfortable when I feel that, the question becomes, well, what are we asking? What do we do, right? Like, does our concern for women's rights become a sort of justification that we need to either prolong the war or go back or, invade again? And the question I want to ask is, to what extent is security a part of women's right, the peace? To what extent is the ability to be able to walk safely and send your children to school without fear of a bomb or a landmine or anything, to what extent do we consider these things part of women's rights? And notwithstanding, the destruction of civilian infrastructure that happens because of war. So we need to be careful, I think, not to fall to that kind of rhetoric that is sort of enabling war. And one of the things we look at in my class on women gender in the Muslim world is Laura Bush's speech right after 9/11. It was in November 2001. And the whole speech was mobilizing support for the war in Afghanistan, and it entirely centered on women's rights in Afghanistan. And the question becomes, Why did Laura Bush care then? Taliban had been in power since 1996. These abuses against women had been going on for at least 5 years, let's say. Why did we suddenly say, oh, we need to go liberate Afghan women? And a lot of, to the rest of the world, we looked very hypocritical because it appeared that it's only when it's in our interest, then we're going to talk about the rights of Afghan women. What about the rights of Saudi women, who is Saudi Arabia is a big ally of the United States, and women there are not treated very well either, And so I think just arguing for moral consistency, I feel like, as Dr. Royden just said, we need to examine our foreign policies and try to have our foreign policies more in line with our values as a nation, and just to become more morally consistent, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Royden and Dr. Mubarak. Not necessarily only for coming to educate us on this crisis, but also just using your years and years of experience to give your opinions and then allow us the space to reflect as well. So at this time, we have about like 2 to 3 questions that we can ask before we move to the rotunda. So does anyone have any questions they would like to ask?
Yeah.
Okay, my main question would be, what, in your opinions, would the US or the world have to do to ease the tension in Afghanistan currently? And on top of that, would you say that the US troops evacuating from Afghanistan helped in that effort?
Okay, so I'm going to reveal a pretty significant bias here, in that I'm not sure how successful the world can be at imposing some sort of artificial something in Afghanistan without the committed cooperation of the Afghan people. And I would say that actually is my answer to almost any, but whether it's Afghanistan or not. I think that one of the things that hopefully, I'm a dreamer, we have learned is that, Afghanistan has incredibly complex social, political, and economic structures that existed before we arrived to give them democracy. It's not that the Afghan people aren't capable of democracy. Of course they are. Any people is capable of democracy. But the priorities, the work, what they want to be is something for them to answer. And where we can assist is when we are invited to provide that support. Now, I do believe that we have a moral obligation to offer support to Afghanistan in ways that align with our values, but also respond to their needs. We're not close to that right now, right? But it's just a very complicated question. How do we operate in the world? That's what I think we need to be examining, right? We have enormous capacity. I actually think our values are pretty good when we live them. So it is, I'm teaching a class in US foreign policy right now, and a couple of you are in it, and I'm kind of laughing because one of the things Americans struggle with is that there aren't always answers. We can't always fix things, and it isn't always our job to fix things. But yes, I do believe we still have an obligation in places where we have made things worse. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question. Sorry.
I think it is very honorable for every citizen in America to feel obligated to help everyone in need. I think that's something that we feel is coined in America. Practicability-wise, it might be hard for us to make practices to pass laws. We've already tried to go over there and help them, we being the US, and that didn't work successfully. So just to impose that another country go and do the same. They might start to impose their own beliefs. And I do like the point that you make. It depends on what the Afghan people want. What do they want their community to look like? And they're the only ones that are going to necessarily be able to tell us that, because they're the ones living in it. So I think just kind of like, on a more personal note, just spreading the information, being aware, being able to, kind of trump some of those false premises that you hear about it, just to help inform people so that they can get a better idea on what's happening. So when they do have that opportunity to evoke change, then they'll be a little bit more informed to say, oh, this is something that we should do, without necessarily telling them what to do, if that helps.
I would just echo the same thing in terms of, we can't really impose. I mean, I think a valuable lesson is that we can't really impose something that does not organically stem indigenously from that community. And, we see that even with, countries in the Middle East that claim to be presidentially democratic or have a parliament or whatnot. It's a very faulty system. And sometimes there were indigenous institutions and ways of being democratic that don't maybe resemble our system that worked, but those were sort of dismantled, right? That was one thing that happened in Afghanistan as well, kind of the unraveling of those institutions of how they ran their affairs through tribal councils and whatnot. So.
And I'd also just add on that one note, we haven't fixed our own problems. So, I mean, if you want to know how, you might want to go talk to some of the indigenous peoples who live here, right? So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
So I'm trying to get the exact words right. Before you were saying that, not that it's our guilt, but it's kind of our responsibility, like the choices we make in electing people and what occurs in Afghanistan that America chooses to do. In what ways can we as citizens make choices to get America to do the things that would help Afghanistan the most?
Oh, that's a huge question. I would say the first place to start is not to look away and to lean into the discomfort of recognizing the full spectrum of who we are. And, some of that is wonderful and some of that is ugly. And it is not unpatriotic to lean into the discomfort of truth, right? And to allow, well, first of all, I mean, I'd love to see Americans listen. Oops, that's my mother, I'm not kidding you. Every time. So, I would say that do not underestimate the power of witnessing. It's something that I actually feel pretty passionately about. The West, not just the United States, has a bit of a white savior thing going on that we can, and we've had that for a long time, right? That we can go in and fix it, right? And you know what would be remarkable is if we actually created the relationships that would allow us to better understand so that we can use our capacity in ways that are meaningful. But I will say that means not demonizing politics. We live in a society where it's like, oh, politics is awful, politics is terrible. I was at a recruitment day one day here, and a nice young man asked his father, standing several feet away, what is political science? And his father said, that's where they teach you how to lie. Oh. Yeah, so that was a high point for me that day. But the point is that, if the way to change is through politics, we have to learn how to have a better politics. And that really is we do that. We do it.
Just from a more of an international point of view, I grew up in India, I was born in India, but I grew up in Bahrain, and I came here only as an undergrad. And a lot of the times that I've seen here consistently is people playing the blaming game. when the Afghanistan events, recent events had happened and people started hearing more about it and hearing more about what has been going on for the past 20 years, it became like a blaming game on which politician to blame rather than looking at the current event itself and deciding how to best help out over there. And like Dr. Royden said, as an American, if for Americans, you guys don't feel the guilt, but you do have a sense of responsibility because at the end of the day, you do realize that your president is holding the most powerful position in the whole world. And that's a known fact is, they hold the most powerful seat, whoever's sitting over there. And how you come to conclusions and how you come on deciding who to elect is, I feel like it's become more of how it's going to help our country and our country only, rather than looking at the bigger picture that there's more than just one country in this world. And looking at how any decision that's being made here is going to affect and have a domino effect more like with the other countries. But to answer your question on how, they can more educate themselves, I believe it's more of an internal thing. A lot of people, especially people who are here, Americans who are here, you made that decision to come out today. You made that decision to educate yourself more. And a lot of the times people blame it on others. So like, we don't have much education, we don't have much resources in it, which, to a fair point, it is true. But a lot of the times it takes that internal push to be like, you need to understand that you don't know every single fact in this world. You don't know what's happening around this world. My mom always used to say the saying in Tamil, she's probably gonna watch this and be like, I told you so. But she would always say, as much as you're educated, as much as you feel like you know everything in the world, you always have to remember that you only know a handful of sand, and there's a lot of grains of sand in the beach. You don't know. As much as you think you know everything, you don't. You're not even close to knowing everything. And having that push and having that sense of ability to be like, yes, I don't know everything. I'm going to go out there, educate myself, and then make a decision based on multiple dimensions rather than that one dimension that's been passed down to me by generation. And that's the only thing about what's good for me and what's good for my country.
Thank you, Callie. And thank you all so much for your input and the conversation we've had tonight. We are actually going to transition away from the panel and discussion and towards, we have some food outside for people to partake in. So please help yourselves. There's also an opportunity to write cards that will be sent along with the donations. If you brought donations, you can drop them off. Because we're actually going to send a truckload of donations to, I can't remember the exact fort, but there's a fort base, Air Force base in New Jersey where a lot of the Afghan refugees that are coming into the United States are currently staying and working on their transition into their new lives here. And so we are trying to collect items that are very much needed for them. And so that's things like winter clothing, specifically Tylenol, notebooks, pencils, but again, really like any like winter clothing, socks, underwear, things like that. So we will be continuing collecting those donations throughout this week, and also next week you can drop them by the chapel. We will have a designated box and room for that somewhere in the back over here. And I think if you have any other questions for our panelists, they might be hanging around for the reception. You might be able to ask them individually. So thank you all so much for coming and have a good night.